The cabin was quiet, the seatbelt sign still lit, and all he had done was sit in the chair he had paid for. Yet within minutes, Dr. Elijah Monroe, a world-renowned neurosurgeon and CEO, was being escorted down the aisle like a criminal. No raised voice, no broken rule, just a man, in first class, whose very presence unsettled a system built on silent bias. Now pause for a moment. What if it were you? What if every glance suggested you didn't belong, and the rules bent only to push you out? Would you lower your eyes, accept their judgment, and walk away quietly? Or would you fight not with anger, but with truth strong enough to bring an entire industry to its knees? This isn't just about a flight. It's about dignity, belonging, and the invisible lines drawn to remind some people of their place. But what happens when the person they try to erase is the very one holding the power to expose them? This is the story of Dr. Elijah Monroe, a story of humiliation turned into accountability, a story of hope born from injustice. If this resonates, please like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the journey that follows. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't broken a rule. He hadn't even asked for anything more than the seat he had paid for. And yet, there he was. Dr. Elijah Monroe dragged out of his first-class seat on Flight 407, his suit jacket twisted under the hands of two uniformed officers, his carry-on left behind in the overhead bin. He wasn't loud. He wasn't a threat. He was just black. The aisle was narrow, lined with strangers who looked away, some with shame, some with relief that it wasn't them. Others stared openly, eyes sharp with the curiosity of people who consume humiliation like entertainment. The only sound was the squeak of polished shoes against the carpet and the occasional metallic clink from a badge swinging as security guided him forward. Elijah didn't resist. He didn't plead. His face was calm, though a storm pressed behind his eyes. The cabin light shimmered off his skin as if trying to spotlight a spectacle no one asked for. Passengers whispered. A woman clutched her pearl necklace. A man raised his phone, screen glowing as he captured the scene for his feed. Another muttered, "Must have done something wrong," under his breath. But Elijah had done nothing wrong. Minutes earlier, he had settled into seat 1A, adjusting his tie, sliding a leather briefcase beneath the seat in front of him. He had boarded early, quietly, just as he had done countless times on flights across the country. There was nothing unusual except the eyes. From the moment he stepped onto the plane, he had felt them, measuring him, questioning him, wondering what a man like him was doing in a space like this. He carried himself with the steady grace of a surgeon used to long hours and high stakes, his shoulders square, his voice low, his movements precise. But even dignity can't always shield against bias. The truth was, Dr. Elijah Monroe was not only a neurosurgeon, he was also the CEO of Metasphere Health, a medical technology group preparing to sign a $900 million partnership with a national hospital system. His face had appeared in magazines. His research had saved lives. His leadership was respected in boardrooms across the country. But here, inside the cabin of Summit Air, none of that seemed to matter. Here, he was just another passenger whose presence had disrupted the unspoken picture of who belonged in first class. The irony pressed on his chest the very morning he was traveling to secure one of the largest healthcare contracts in recent history. He was being treated as though he had stolen a seat. As the officers escorted him past row after row, Elijah felt the silence grow heavier. No one intervened. No one asked why. The silence of strangers often speaks louder than insults. He thought of his grandmother, who had raised him in a small brick house in Birmingham. She used to say, "Baby, they'll measure you before you open your mouth. Walk tall, so they have to measure twice." He had lived by those words his whole life. And yet, here he was, being measured down to nothing in the span of minutes. When the officers reached the jet bridge, Elijah glanced back once. His briefcase still sat neatly by his seat, initials E, pressed into the leather. Inside were the documents, the proposals, the contracts that could redefine health access for millions. But in that moment, he was no longer seen as the architect of solutions. He was framed as the problem. The passengers' eyes followed him out, but their silence was the loudest voice in the room. And as the door shut behind him, one thought pulsed clear in Elijah's mind. This isn't just about a seat on a plane. This is about who gets erased before they even sit down. The morning had started, like countless others, for Dr. Elijah Monroe, though his schedule carried a weight heavier than most. He rose before dawn, as he always did, his body conditioned by years of surgical rotations and executive meetings. By 6 o'clock, he was dressed in a charcoal suit, a pale blue shirt, and a tie his daughter had given him for Father's Day, a tie dotted with tiny silver patterns, subtle enough to be professional, personal enough to remind him of home. Atlanta's morning air carried a crisp chill as he stepped into the black sedan that carried him to Hartsfield-Jackson International. The driver offered polite small talk, but Elijah's mind was already fixed on the day ahead. The $900 million hospital deal wasn't just another contract. It was a chance to reshape patient access to cutting-edge neuro-AI systems across the nation. If signed, it would expand care to regions that had never seen specialized neurosurgery. To Elijah, it wasn't about money. It was about legacy. He checked his watch, still plenty of time. At the terminal, the familiar buzz of rolling suitcases and overhead announcements greeted him. Travelers bustled through security. Families clustered with strollers. Business people power-walked toward their gates. It was, on the surface, an ordinary day. Elijah moved with practiced calm, scanning his boarding pass, greeting a TSA officer with a courteous nod. He had long ago mastered the balance of standing tall while moving silently, but ordinary days have a way of shifting in an instant. At gate C-14, a line had begun to snake around the stanchions. The large digital sign above displayed the Summit Air logo and the destination, New York City. Elijah joined the line, his leather carry-on rolling smoothly behind him, initials E.M. glinting faintly on the handle. When it was his turn, he stepped forward to the biometric scanner. The machine chirped once, then flashed red. A flat voice announced, "Identity not verified. Please step aside." Elijah blinked, leaned slightly toward the lens, and tried again. Another red light, another flat rejection. The passengers behind him shifted impatiently, one man exhaling loudly as if Elijah's presence alone had disrupted his timeline. Tyler Brooks, the gate agent, appeared from behind the counter, young, with a sharp haircut and a badge swinging around his neck. He wore the smirk of someone who believed in his own authority a little too much. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside for manual verification," Tyler said, his tone polite on the surface, but with an edge beneath it. Elijah met his gaze. "The system should recognize me. My traveler profile has been active for years." Tyler shrugged, tapping the screen. "Sometimes it struggles with certain profiles." His eyes lingered on Elijah's face just a beat too long. The words landed with the subtlety of a brick. Elijah inhaled slowly, steadying himself. This was not new. He had seen it before, machines trained on biased data sets. Human employees hiding prejudice behind technical glitches. He stepped aside. As he waited, two white businessmen approached the scanner. Green light, access granted, smooth as silk. Elisha watched silently, folding his arms. A woman across the counter stifled a laugh as Tyler typed something into the system. His phone buzzed on the desk. Elisha's eyes, sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, caught a glimpse of a chat thread, a photo of him just moments earlier. Captioned, "Guess who's playing VIP today?" Tiny laughing emojis dotted the screen. He didn't move. He didn't speak. But his jaw tightened. His patience a thin wire. The system beeped again. Tyler leaned closer to the screen, frowned, then glanced at Elijah with a mix of pity and condescension. "Sir, it looks like we'll need a supervisor. Could be a deeper verification error." Behind him, Marissa Doyle, the chief flight attendant for the flight, appeared, mid-40s. Her posture was as crisp as her pressed uniform. She carried herself with the kind of authority that demanded attention, though her eyes carried a faint impatience, as though Elijah's presence had already inconvenienced her schedule. "Problem here?" she asked. Voice clipped. "Scanner won't verify," Tyler said quickly. Marissa looked Elijah up and down, her gaze sweeping from his polished shoes to the tie knotted neatly at his collar. She offered a tight smile that did not reach her eyes. "We'll take care of it." Her words were professional, but her tone carried a chill. Alicia's phone buzzed. A reminder from his calendar. Meeting with Federal Hospital Board. 2 p.m. He dismissed the alert, pocketing the phone. He had time. What he did not have was patience for the familiar rhythm of subtle dismissal. After several keystrokes, the system finally cleared, spitting out a boarding confirmation. Tyler gestured toward the gate. "All set. Mr. Monroe, you can proceed now." Elijah nodded once. No thank you. No smile. Just the silent dignity of a man unwilling to offer gratitude for what should have been his right. As he walked down the jet bridge, he caught fragments of whispered laughter behind him. He carried no anger on his face, but inside, a fire stirred. He remembered his grandmother's words again. Walk tall. He had been walking tall his entire life, but even the tallest walk could not prevent shadows from following. Boarding the plane. Elijah placed his carry-on carefully in the overhead bin above seat 1A. He adjusted his tie once more, sat down, and exhaled slowly. The cabin around him shimmered with soft gold lighting, leather seats gleaming. Yet he felt the weight of 20 eyes measuring him, the unspoken question hovering, does he belong here? The flight had not yet taken off, and already the journey felt heavier than the miles ahead. Dr. Elijah Monroe adjusted the seatbelt across his lap, letting the leather of the first-class chair cradle his back. The cabin smelled faintly of citrus and new upholstery, the sort of curated luxury that Summit Air marketed to its elite passengers. He had sat in these seats many times before, but today the air felt heavier, as if the room itself were pressing down. He slid his tablet from the briefcase, the lock screen glowing with notes for his upcoming meeting. But before he could lose himself in the data, a voice startled him. "Excuse me, sir," said a man in the row across the aisle. He was older, silver hair combed neatly, his wrist heavy with a gold watch that he tapped impatiently. He held out a crumpled napkin and an empty coffee cup. "Could you take this?" Elijah lifted his eyes, slow and deliberate. For a moment, silence hung in the air between them. The request was simple, yet layered. The man had not registered Elijah's tailored suit, the monogrammed case by his feet, or the aura of quiet command he carried. He had only registered skin. "I'm sorry," Elijah asked softly. The man blinked, realization dawning like a late sunrise. Oh, I thought, never mind." His cheeks flushed pink as he pulled the cup back, muttering something about poor lighting. Elijah said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was heavier than rebuke. He turned back to his screen, but the sting of the moment lingered like smoke. From behind, a child's voice rose, innocent and unfiltered. "Mommy, why is that man sitting up here? He's brown." A hush fell over the row. The mother yanked the boy's arm down quickly. "Shh, Caleb. That's not polite." Her voice trembled with embarrassment. She smiled weakly at Elijah, a smile that asked for absolution without ever offering accountability. Elijah met the boy's wide eyes, then looked back at the window, where the tarmac shimmered beneath the sun. He wasn't angry with the child. Children ask what they see. It was the world that had taught him to see difference as disruption. Whispers fluttered like moths in the rows nearby. A woman in pearls leaned toward her husband. "They let anyone in here these days," she muttered. The man chuckled softly, not bothering to lower his voice. Elijah's fingers tightened on the armrest, knuckles whitening against the polished surface. His mind drifted back to his first year in medical school. The lecture hall filled with voices louder than his, dismissive of his questions, his answers overlooked until repeated by another. He had learned then that the cut of exclusion is often delivered with a smile. The tension in the cabin thickened until the chime of a flight attendant's voice broke through. "Would you like a mimosa before takeoff?" The woman standing beside him was Marissa Doyle. Her tone was sweetened, yet edged with something else, like sugar over steel. Elijah tilted his head. "Are drinks not offered to all first-class passengers?" Marissa faltered for a fraction of a second. "Of course. I just thought you might like one." "Sparkling water will be fine," Elijah replied, his voice even. She nodded quickly, retreating down the aisle. Across the cabin, a passenger lowered his phone, screen tilted just enough for Elijah to catch a glimpse. A photograph of him had been taken, already uploaded to a group chat. A caption scrolled across the top. "Guess who's cosplaying CEO today?" A cascade of laughing emojis trailed underneath. Elijah's chest rose and fell once, slow and deliberate. He tapped his tablet open, scrolling through slides he had already memorized, using the discipline of focus as armor. Yet the laughter, though muffled, gnawed at the edges of his calm. Minutes later, Marissa returned with the sparkling water, setting it on his tray with fingers that lingered just long enough to feel rehearsed. Elijah gave a polite nod, then looked past her. His silence was no longer passive. It was sharpened into defiance. From the corner of his eye, he saw Sophia Nguyen, seated a few rows back. She had boarded quietly, carrying nothing but a small camera bag. Now, she observed the scene with sharp eyes, her phone resting lightly in her hand. A journalist's instinct stirred in her, though Elijah had no idea she existed yet. The cabin hummed with the low murmur of travelers settling in. But beneath that hum ran an undercurrent, a rhythm Elijah knew too well. It was the rhythm of suspicion, of whispers that judged before understanding, of gazes that cut deeper than words. When the captain's voice crackled overhead, welcoming passengers aboard Summit Air Flight 407, Elijah closed his eyes for a moment. He breathed in, steadying himself. He had not come here for conflict. He had come here to build something larger than himself. But prejudice rarely checks your calendar before arriving. The plane shuddered lightly as preparations for pushback began. Elijah's phone buzzed in his pocket. A single message from his operations director. Everything ready for the board. Good luck today. He typed back quickly. Thank you. We'll update soon. As he slipped the phone away, he noticed Charles Whitman in the row behind him. The lawyer's expression was cautious, thoughtful, as if weighing whether to speak. But he said nothing, only offered a slight nod. Elijah returned it faintly, then leaned back, eyes fixed on the aisle. He could feel something building, like static before a storm. The flight had not yet lifted from the ground, but already the stage was set. The hum of the engines deepened as flight attendants moved briskly through the cabin. Doctor, Elijah Monroe adjusted the cuff of his shirt and tried to focus on his tablet. But the low murmur of passengers around him still carried an unmistakable weight. He had learned to ignore whispers, but today the air felt like it was pressing against his skin. 2 rows back, Marissa Doyle lingered by the galley curtain. Her posture was taut. Her voice lowered as she whispered to a younger attendant whose name badge read Holly Reyes. Holly was in her mid-20s, quick with a smirk, phone already in hand. She angled it down as if checking messages, but her thumb hovered over a live-streaming app. Just be careful, Marissa murmured, glancing toward Elijah's seat. We don't need this blowing up. Holly smirked. Relax. People eat this stuff up. A small red dot blinked on her screen. In seconds, hundreds of viewers tuned in. Holly angled the phone just enough to capture Elijah sitting in 1A, scrolling silently through his tablet. She whispered into the camera, her lips curling into a sly grin. See, told y'all. Not everyone belongs in first class. Sometimes affirmative action just buys a ticket. Hearts and laughing emojis poured across the screen. Viewers typed fast. Looks like he's lost. Is he staff? Did he sneak in? The comments blurred, cruel in their speed. Elijah didn't look up, but he felt it. The way silence shifts when someone nearby is mocking you. The way glances linger longer than they should. He turned a page on his tablet, his hand steady, though his pulse quickened. Holly angled the camera back toward herself, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Premium seats are for premium guests. Some of us earn them. Others just slip through when no one's looking. More laughter flooded her screen. She tapped a caption across the video. When confidence equals entitlement. From her seat near the back, Sophia Nguyen noticed the glow of Holly's phone. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing. Her instincts sharpened. She had reported on enough injustices to know when something dangerous was unfolding. Quietly, she lifted her own phone and began recording. Her lens caught both Holly's smug expression and the reflection of Elijah on the screen. The cruelty was not loud. It was subtle, coded in humor, disguised as banter. That made it worse. It allowed others to watch without feeling complicit. Elijah caught the reflection of the red recording light in the glass of the cabin wall. He knew exactly what was happening. Without a word, he slipped his own phone from his jacket pocket. A few taps, and his private monitoring app captured the live feed URL. The evidence was stored in a secure folder before Holly even ended her stream. Marissa returned, her tone falsely bright as she addressed Elijah. Dr. Monroe, may I have a quick word with you in the galley? The way she phrased it was not a request. Passengers glanced up again, curiosity flickering like sparks. Elijah stood, his height commanding the narrow aisle, and followed her toward the back. Inside the galley, the buzz of the cabin dimmed, replaced by the metallic clatter of trays and the faint hiss of brewing coffee. Holly was there too, phone tucked hastily into her apron. A doctor? Monroe, Marissa began, her hands clasped. It seems there's been a seating reassignment. We'll need you to move to row 34E. Elijah's eyes narrowed. Row 34E is economy. It's a passenger configurable seat, Marissa replied quickly, her words practiced. Elijah pulled his phone from his pocket and opened the Summit Air app. His booking still displayed seat 1A. His profile still showed Elite Premier status. But now, a red alert glared beneath it. Flagged for secondary review, disruptive conduct. His voice was low, even but sharp as glass. Disruptive conduct. I've sat in silence since boarding. Marissa avoided his eyes. Sometimes the system makes errors. It's nothing personal. Elijah leaned closer, his presence filling the narrow space. It's always personal. Someone entered this manually. Who flagged me? Neither Marissa nor Holly answered. Their silence was answer enough. He exhaled, long and deliberate. Then, without raising his voice, he said, I am returning to my seat. If you wish to escalate, you'll need to restrain me in front of every passenger. For a beat, no one moved. Marissa's lips parted, but no sound came. Finally, she stepped aside. Elijah walked back down the aisle, his posture straight, his silence louder than any protest. Passengers turned away. Others stared, but none spoke. Charles Whitman met his eyes as he passed, offering the faintest nod, a silent acknowledgement that something was deeply wrong. When Elijah sat again in 1A, he opened his tablet as if nothing had happened. His fingers trembled only slightly. 2 rows back, a man whispered to his seatmate. He's making it a race thing. His companion shook her head. No, they're making it 1. Elijah ignored them, his gaze fixed on the window, where sunlight poured across the tarmac. The reflection staring back at him was calm, composed, but beneath the surface, a fire grew hotter. The plane had not yet left the gate, but the cabin's atmosphere had shifted into something brittle, ready to crack. Doctor? Elijah Monroe sat rigid in his seat, his tablet open on the tray table, though his eyes barely scanned the words glowing on the screen. His mind was elsewhere, processing every detail with the precision of a surgeon examining an X-ray for hairline fractures. He could feel the storm circling closer. Marissa Doyle's voice came again, this time from the intercom, cheerful in tone, but firm in intent. Ladies and gentlemen, we ask for your cooperation as we finalize boarding and review seating assignments. The message was general, but Elijah felt the weight of its aim. He looked at the red alert still displayed on his phone. Flag for secondary review. Disruptive conduct. He replayed the sequence in his head. He had said nothing. He had done nothing. The only disruption had been his presence. From the galley, Holly Reyes whispered urgently to Marissa, her eyes darting toward Elijah. The video's already getting traction. People are commenting. What if someone recognizes him? Marissa's jaw tightened. Then we keep control. No matter who he is. Procedures are procedures. Elijah caught fragments of their conversation as they passed down the aisle. He let his gaze drift, steady and unreadable. Though inside his thoughts spun, he could speak up. He could announce his title, his credentials. The partnership Summit Air itself had been negotiating with Metasphere Health. He could wield his identity like a shield. But a quieter voice in him argued otherwise. Why should he have to? Why must every room demand proof of worth before granting basic respect? Why should his dignity be conditional, balanced on the precarious acceptance of strangers? His fingers tightened on the tablet, the screen dimming as the device idled. He remembered another time, years ago, when he was still a resident. Security had stopped him outside an ICU he was assigned to. They asked for proof he belonged there. He had been in scrubs, stethoscope around his neck, ID badge clipped clearly on his chest. None of it had mattered. That night, he had gone home and told himself it was an isolated incident. But incidents have a way of piling up until they form patterns, and patterns are harder to ignore. A shadow fell across his tray table. Charles Whitman leaned slightly forward from his seat behind Elijah. His voice was low, careful. "Do you want me to say something?" Elijah turned, his eyes meeting the lawyer's. Charles looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat as though torn between conscience and fear of confrontation. "No," Elijah said quietly. "Not yet." Charles nodded, retreating, guilt flickering across his face. Sophia Nguyen, a few rows back, kept her phone steady. Her recording captured more than faces. It captured the tension, the silence, the discomfort that rippled through the cabin like an undercurrent no one wanted to acknowledge. Minutes later, Marissa returned, her smile taut, her clipboard clutched like a shield. "Doc Monroe," she began, her tone rehearsed. "For operational reasons, we need you to relocate to row 34E. It will only be temporary." Elijah's gaze sharpened. "My boarding pass says seat 1A. Yes, but the system flagged." He cut her off. His voice was soft, but steel threaded through it. "The system doesn't breathe. Someone made that choice." "Who was it?" Holly shifted uncomfortably beside her, but Marissa pressed on. "It's not about you personally. We just need to ensure compliance." Elijah set his tablet aside, folded his hands together, and leaned slightly forward. "Let me be clear. I paid for this seat. I booked it weeks ago. I've made no disturbance. The only thing that has happened is that you've mistaken my presence for disruption." His words carried across the aisle. A few passengers shifted uneasily. Others pretended not to hear. Marissa's smile cracked, only for a second. "Sir, please understand, we're just following protocol. Protocols are written by people," Elijah replied, "and people decide when to weaponize them." The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. Marissa stepped back, whispering something to Holly before disappearing toward the galley. Holly lingered just long enough to glance at Elijah, her expression flickering between defiance and unease. Elijah leaned back, exhaling slowly. His mind wrestled with two instincts. The first told him to endure, to let the moment pass, to avoid giving them ammunition. The second whispered that silence had never saved anyone. It only fed the system that thrived on it. He tapped a message into his phone, sending it to his operations director flagged misuse detected. Prepare trace. Then he slid the phone back into his pocket. The plane remained at the gate, but inside, the walls seemed to close tighter around him. The whispers continued, the stares lingered, and the fire inside him grew hotter, steadier. He was not loud. He was not disruptive. But he was done being silent. The cabin door had not yet closed when two uniformed security officers stepped onto the aircraft. Their dark jackets bore the Summit Air insignia. Their radios crackled softly at their sides. Conversations in the cabin fell quiet, replaced by the uneasy hush of anticipation. Dr. Elijah Monroe knew before they spoke that they had come for him. Marissa Doyle led them down the aisle with quick, clipped steps, her eyes darting nervously from passenger to passenger. Holly Reyes trailed just behind, her lips pressed into a line, phone buried deep in her apron pocket as though hiding evidence could erase what she had already done. "Elijah Monroe," one of the officers said flatly, his voice carrying over the cabin. We need you to come with us." Dozens of eyes turned, some wide with curiosity, others narrowed with suspicion. Elijah sat still in 1A, his posture composed, hands resting lightly on his knees. He looked at the officer, then at Marissa, who avoided his gaze. "On what grounds?" Elijah asked. His voice was calm, deliberate. The officer shifted. "You've been flagged as a disruptive passenger. For the safety of the flight, you'll need to disembark." A ripple moved through the cabin. Passengers exchanged whispers. Disruptive. He had barely spoken since boarding, but the label alone was enough to brand him guilty in the eyes of many. Elijah's jaw tightened. Slowly, he reached for his leather briefcase beneath the seat. His initials gleamed in the dim light. He held it for a moment, then looked back toward Charles Whitman. "Would you mind holding this until I return?" Elijah asked. The lawyer blinked, startled, then nodded. "Of course." His hand closed around the handle with an unspoken promise. Elijah rose. His height filled the narrow aisle, his presence commanding despite the humiliation pressing in around him. The officers flanked him, guiding him forward. He did not resist, did not raise his voice. He moved with the steady grace of a man who understood that dignity, once surrendered, is difficult to reclaim. The aisle felt longer than it ever had before. Each row became a gallery of silent witnesses. A woman clutched her handbag closer, as though proximity alone endangered her. A man muttered, "Knew it," under his breath. A teenager raised his phone, recording with eager eyes. But there were others. Sophia Nguyen's camera caught every second, her expression firm, determined. She had seen injustice before, but something about Elijah's quiet composure struck deeper. She knew this wasn't just another viral clip. It was a story that demanded telling. Caleb Johnson twisted in his seat, tugging at his mother's arm. "Mommy, why are they taking him? He didn't do anything." His small voice cut through the silence. His mother hushed him quickly, eyes downcast, but the boy's question lingered in the air. Elijah heard it. The innocence, the clarity. He wanted to turn back, to reassure the child, but the officers urged him forward. His polished shoes squeaked softly against the carpet. The metallic swing of a badge clinked in rhythm with each step. Near the front, Marissa stood stiffly by the galley, avoiding eye contact as he passed. For a brief moment, Elias stopped beside her. His voice was low enough for only her to hear. "You know the truth," he said evenly. Marissa's throat bobbed, but she said nothing. The officers led him off the plane, past the threshold of the cabin door and onto the jet bridge. The cool air from the terminal brushed against his face, sharp against the heat that burned in his chest. He glanced back once, just long enough to see the cabin door close behind him. His briefcase remained in Charles's care, a silent witness to everything he had lost in that moment. The walk down the jet bridge was lined with silence, broken only by the hiss of air conditioning vents and the murmur of distant announcements. Elijah's thoughts flickered his grandmother's words, his daughter's laughter, the meeting that awaited him in New York. He carried them all like fragile glass, steadying himself against the weight of humiliation. In the waiting area, a few passengers looked up, startled by the sight of him escorted by security. One woman pulled her child closer. Another man lifted his phone to snap a photo, curiosity outweighing empathy. The officer stopped near a side door. One spoke into his radio, words curt and bureaucratic. Passenger Monroe removed, awaiting supervisor clearance. Elias stood still, his breathing measured. His dignity was intact, but each second pressed against him like a reminder of how quickly perception could turn a man into a threat. He thought again of the label stamped across his profile. Disruptive. The word echoed in his mind. Hollow and absurd. A surgeon. A CEO. A man on his way to reshape healthcare, and in the narrow logic of prejudice, he was simply disruptive. The officers shifted uncomfortably beside him. Perhaps they sensed it too, the imbalance, the wrongness. But neither spoke. They were instruments of procedure, bound by silence. Back inside the cabin, Sophia lowered her phone slowly. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from urgency. She had captured everything: the live-stream mockery, the false reassignment, the removal. She knew the world needed to see it. Charles Whitman still held Elijah's briefcase, his expression grave. For the first time in years, the lawyer felt the sting of complicity, the cost of silence. Caleb leaned against the window, eyes wide, repeating softly to himself, "He didn't do anything." On the jet bridge, Elijah straightened his shoulders, refusing to bow beneath the weight of humiliation. The fire inside him had shifted. It was no longer the restless burn of anger. It was something steadier, sharper, a resolve hardening into steel. This was no longer about a seat on a plane. It was about the story they were writing of him, a story he had not chosen, but one he would now reclaim. The supervisor who had been called to meet the officers finally appeared at the end of the jet bridge. His suit was too sharp for the hour. His tie knotted perfectly, but his expression faltered when his eyes fell on Elijah Monroe. He glanced at the tablet in his hand, then back to the man who stood calm but unyielding, flanked by two officers who seemed more uncertain by the minute. "Dr. Monroe," the supervisor said, his voice wrapped in false politeness. "I'm afraid we've had some concerns raised about your ticketing credentials and behavior on board. We'll need to clear those before you can continue travel." Elijah's gaze cut through him. Concerns, he asked evenly. "What exactly have I done that warrants removing me from a seat I purchased at full fare?" The supervisor shifted, searching for an answer. "Our system registered a flag," he said finally, tapping the screen of his tablet. "It indicates," Elijah raised a hand. "Stop." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of command. That flag was entered manually. It wasn't generated by any automated system. And I know this because I helped design the protocols that govern those systems. The supervisor blinked, confused. The officers exchanged glances. Elijah reached slowly into his jacket pocket, pulling out his phone. With a few swipes, he opened a secured application shielded by encryption layers beyond the comprehension of the average administrator. The screen glowed with streams of code, access logs, and timestamps. "You don't recognize this dashboard," Elijah said, holding the phone where they could see. "But your operations center does. Every manual override, every improper flag, every misuse of the verification system is logged here. And this," he tapped once. The data expanding to reveal the exact entry was keyed in at 7:42 p.m. by staff ID Doyle M. The name lingered like smoke. The supervisor's composure cracked. One of the officers muttered, "That's the lead attendant." Alicia's eyes sharpened. "Exactly. Your employee marked me as disruptive with no basis. She and others mocked me, live-streamed me, and then colluded to erase my place on that plane. That's not a glitch. That's intent." Passengers who had gathered near the gate began whispering, phones raised, catching every word. A man in a baseball cap whispered, "He's showing receipts." A woman gasped as Elijah zoomed in on the log entry, the initials glowing unmistakably. The supervisor's throat tightened. "Dr. Monroe, Perhaps we can discuss this in a private lounge. No, Elijah cut in, his tone precise as a scalpel. We'll discuss it here, in the open, with witnesses. Because for too long, what happens in private rooms gets buried under paperwork. Not tonight. The officers stepped back slightly, no longer sure if they were escorts or bystanders. One muttered into his radio again, but static filled the channel. Elijah's phone buzzed quietly in his palm. A message flashed from an encrypted contact, lockout protocol engaged. Summit Air Ops frozen, awaiting further instruction. He slid the phone back into his pocket, his expression unreadable. Here's what's happening, Elijah said, his voice calm but resonant, carrying across the waiting area. At this very moment, your systems are under audit. Every bias flag, every discriminatory override, every slur-laced channel you thought was hidden, it's being preserved and reviewed. And when the board wakes up tomorrow, they'll learn that the airline they trusted to uphold standards of equity chose to drag a surgeon and CEO off a plane for daring to exist in first class. The crowd stirred. A few clapped softly. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Sophia Nguyen, standing near the boarding counter with her phone still streaming, whispered into her microphone, "This is history happening live." The supervisor tried to recover. "Dr. Monroe, if you'll just." But Elijah's phone buzzed again. He checked it quickly. A new message, brief and lethal. 900 million contract suspended. Official notice to follow. Metasphere board. He lifted his eyes, pinning the supervisor in place. Do you understand what you've just cost your company? That deal was hours from being announced. $900 million in health logistics. Gone because you allowed bias to dictate policy. Gas rippled through the crowd. Even the officers froze, the weight of the number sinking in. Elijah inhaled slowly, grounding himself. The anger that had smoldered since the scanner failed, since the whispers in the cabin, since the live stream mockery, it was no longer a storm. It had crystallized into something sharper. A weapon, yes, but one wielded with purpose. This isn't about me being inconvenienced, Elijah continued, voice steady. It's about a system that sees someone like me as a problem before it ever sees me as a person. And now, that system will be held accountable. For a long moment, silence filled the terminal. Then Caleb Johnson's voice, small but clear, rose again. "See, Mommy, I told you he didn't do anything." The boy's words cut through the tension, innocent but undeniable. The crowd's energy shifted. Some passengers nodded. Others murmured agreement. The tide of perception was turning, and Elijah stood at the center, not as a man accused, but as a man exposing truth. The supervisor's tablet beeped frantically, notifications flooding. His face drained of color. They're locking us out," he muttered. Aaliyah stepped closer, his presence towering. "No, I'm locking you out because you tried to erase me. And when you erase the wrong person, sometimes the whole system erases with them." The terminal buzzed with the kind of restless energy that only comes when ordinary people sense they are standing inside a moment much larger than themselves. Dozens of phones were raised, recording everything. Social media notifications chirped across the concourse like birds at dawn. By the time the first news alerts hit national feeds, some Summit Air executives were already scrambling, their polished shoes echoing across marble floors as they converged on the gate. At the center of it all, Elijah Monroe stood with the officers, his posture straight, his face calm but unyielding. He hadn't raised his voice once, yet the entire room seemed to orbit around his presence. The supervisor clutched his tablet like a shield, his hands trembling as new alerts continued to flood the screen. The glass doors to the VIP corridor opened, and 3 executives strode through, their expressions stretched tight with panic. One was a woman in a tailored gray suit, her hair pinned in a severe bun, the kind of presence that screamed corporate triage. Beside her walked a man with silver-framed glasses, his phone pressed to his ear, whispering frantically into the receiver. The third, younger but clearly high-ranking, carried a leather folio like it was a lifeline. The woman was the first to speak. "Dr. Monroe," she said, her tone layered with urgency. "We need to step into a private lounge and resolve this before the situation escalates further." Elijah looked at her, then at the growing crowd of passengers who were no longer just bystanders, but witnesses. "It's already escalated," he replied evenly, "and I will not step into a back room where accountability disappears into legal spin. Whatever you have to say it here." The crowd murmured approval. Sophia Nguyen's live stream feed ticked upward thousands, then tens of thousands of viewers. Comments poured in so fast she could barely keep up. "This is history. Stay strong, doctor. Don't let them silence you. Watching from Chicago, we've seen this too many times." The executive with the silver glasses removed them, rubbing his temples. "Dr. Monroe, this isn't necessary. We can compensate you, restore your seat, and ensure this is never repeated." "Compensation." Elijah's voice cut through the air like glass breaking. "You dragged me from a plane, humiliated me in front of strangers, mocked my very right to sit where I paid to sit. And you think this is about compensation?" He took a step forward, his presence towering over the executive. "No. This is about a culture that marked me as a threat the moment I walked through your scanner. And now, that culture is on trial." The younger executive with the folio cleared his throat, his voice softer, almost pleading. "Dr. Monroe, please understand. We are under immense pressure. If this continues, it could destabilize the airline itself. Investors are watching. Media is already reporting. This could spiral." Elijah tilted his head. "Good. Let it spiral. Maybe the world should finally see how fragile your systems are when held up against truth." The officers shifted uneasily. They had started this evening as enforcers, but now they looked like men caught in a storm far beyond their command. One finally spoke, voice tentative. "Sir, what do you want? What would make this right?" Elijah turned, scanning the faces before him. He saw Charles Whitman clutching his briefcase like a silent vow. He saw Caleb Johnson pressed against the glass, eyes wide with innocence. He saw Sophia Nguyen's camera fixed unwaveringly, her viewers swelling by the second. He saw dozens of strangers who, for the first time, seemed to recognize him not as a disruption, but as a man demanding dignity. "I want acknowledgement," Elijah said, his tone firm but measured. "Not just for me, for every person who has been erased, sidelined, or silenced by the systems you built. I want transparency. I want accountability. And I want your assurance that this ends tonight, not with spin, but with change." The gray-suited woman's lips pressed into a thin line. She whispered something to her colleague, who shook his head, panic flashing in his eyes. Their world of closed-door negotiations and tightly managed crises was slipping away, and Elijah knew it. Just then, the monitors above the gate flickered. Departure times dissolved, replaced by a stark red banner. "Summit Air operations suspended pending review." Gas echoed across the concourse. Phones lit up in unison. The supervisor dropped his tablet, the sound clattering against the polished floor. "God," he muttered, It's happening. Elijah's phone buzzed again. A secure message from Metasphere Ops Lockout confirmed. Board prepared to issue public statement. Media coordination underway. The gray-suited woman's composure finally cracked. "You did this?" she said, her voice trembling between accusation and awe. Elijah met her gaze without blinking. "No," he said quietly. "You did this. You gave me no choice." The crowd erupted, some cheering, some filming, some simply staring in disbelief. Sophia's livestream comments exploded. "He shut down the airline. This is bigger than one man. Justice in real time." Caleb tugged at his mother's sleeve again. "Mommy, is he a superhero?" he whispered. His mother's eyes glistened as she looked at Elijah, then back at her son. "Maybe," she said softly. "Maybe he is." The executives huddled together, frantic whispers passing between them. One finally broke away, approaching Elijah with a look of reluctant surrender. "Dr. Monroe, the CEO will want to speak with you directly. He's preparing a live address. Please, if you would just wait here." Elijah shook his head. "No more waiting. I will hear from him here, now, in front of every witness. If he wants to apologize, he will do it where the world can see." And with that, Elijah stepped forward into the center of the concourse, the red glow of the suspended operations banner washing across his face. The crowd parted instinctively, giving him space as though he were both judge and witness to something unprecedented. For the first time that night, Elijah allowed himself a small breath of clarity. The humiliation of being dragged down that aisle, the sting of being mislabeled disruptive, the quiet fury he had carried since boarding it had all converged here. This was no longer just his battle. It was a reckoning. And somewhere, in a boardroom lined with glass and fear, Richard Alcott, CEO of Summit Air, was realizing that his empire now hinged on the man they had tried to erase. The departure board screens across the concourse flickered again, the red suspension banner dissolving into a new broadcast feed. A corporate blue background filled the monitors, framed by the Summit Air logo. At the center sat Richard Alcott, CEO of Summit Air, his dark suit tailored to perfection, his expression carefully sculpted into a mask of calm authority. Passengers hushed, turning toward the glowing screens. Executives in the terminal straightened, relief flickering in their eyes as though the presence of their leader might restore control. But Elijah Monroe stood still, his arms crossed lightly, eyes locked on the image above as if he were studying not a man, but a strategy. "Good evening," Alcott began, his voice smooth, rehearsed. "I want to begin by addressing the disruption that has affected our passengers tonight. Summit Air is committed to the highest standards of safety, integrity, and inclusivity. Unfortunately, tonight's events revealed failures in our system. On behalf of the airline, I extend our deepest apologies to Dr. Elijah Monroe, as well as to all passengers inconvenienced." The crowd murmured. Some passengers nodded, others frowned. It was polished, professional, but it felt manufactured, a speech designed for damage control rather than truth. Alcott continued, "We are launching an internal review immediately. Any employee found to have acted outside of protocol will face consequences. This does not reflect who we are as a company. Summit Air values diversity and respect at every level of operation." The younger executive in the terminal exhaled in relief. "See," he whispered to his colleague, "crisis contained." But Elijah lifted his hand, silencing the murmurs around him. His voice, calm but cutting, rose above the crowd. "Contained." He turned, facing the passengers, then pointed toward the glowing screens. That speech is not an apology. It is a performance. Dozens of phones tilted back toward him. Sophia Nguyen angled her live stream, catching his every word. The comments scrolled furiously. He's not buying it. Call him out. Doctor. Truth? PR. Elijah stepped forward, positioning himself beneath the monitor so that the crowd's eyes shifted between his figure and Alcott's face above. He speaks of inclusivity, while his employees live-streamed my humiliation. He speaks of respect, while I was dragged from a seat I purchased lawfully. He calls this a system failure. But let me show you what really happened. He pulled his phone from his pocket and swiped swiftly. The screen glowed bright as he mirrored it to the nearest monitor with a secure override. Gaffes erupted as the corporate feed froze, then shrank to a corner, replaced by a split screen of logs, messages, and video captures. The first video played Holly Reyes, holding her phone just low enough to mock Elijah into a live stream. Her smirk unmistakable as the caption "When affirmative action gets bold" scrolled across. Laughter and emojis poured across the feed. The passengers gasped audibly. Next came the system logs. Elijah zoomed in on the timestamp, 7:42 p.m. Entry keyed by Doyle M. Manual flag. Disruptive passenger. Secondary review required. The evidence glowed. Undeniable. The terminal erupted in whispers. One passenger muttered, "My God, they really set him up." Another shook his head. And they called it a glitch. Elijah raised his voice. This isn't a failure of code. This is a failure of culture. A culture that assumes someone who looks like me does not belong in 1A. A culture that arms bias with technology and calls it procedure. The CEO's polished mask cracked. He shifted visibly on the screen, lips parting as though searching for words that had not been scripted. Dr. Monroe. If we could discuss this night. Elijah interrupted, his tone precise as steel. We will not discuss it behind closed doors. We will confront it here, with every passenger, every camera, and every witness as evidence. The crowd stirred, their energy shifting like a tide pulled by the moon. Caleb Johnson's small voice rose again, cutting through the chaos. He's right. They lied about him. His mother tried to hush him, but it was too late. The child's words had landed, echoing across the concourse like truth from an uncorrupted source. Sophia's live stream comments exploded. Even the kid sees it. You can't spin this anymore. Accountability now. Elijah stepped closer to the crowd. You see, power counts on silence, on people turning away, on whispers behind closed doors. But tonight, you all saw it, and no speech can erase what's been witnessed. The supervisor on the floor looked pale, his drop tablet now buzzing endlessly with alerts he no longer dared touch. The gray-suited woman clenched her fists, realizing no amount of corporate polish could undo what had just been exposed. Elijah turned back to the screen, locking eyes with Alcott, as though piercing the distance between them. You talk about who you are as a company, but tonight, the world has seen who you are, and no amount of public relations can rewrite that. Alcott swallowed visibly, his hand tightening around the edges of his desk. For the first time in his tenure as CEO, control was slipping not to a boardroom rival, not to investors, but to the very passenger they had tried to erase. Elijah lowered his voice, but every word carried, If you want to prove this is not who you are, then don't apologize to me. Apologize to the boy who watched you drag me away. Apologize to the passengers who saw you weaponize systems against truth. Apologize to the millions watching who have lived this same story, day after day, in offices, schools, and streets. Apologize to them. or admit that this is exactly who you are. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the hum of the airport machinery seemed to fade. For the first time, Richard Alcott's composure shattered. His eyes darted, his jaw clenched. And then, live on every screen. He faltered. His words stumbled. I will return shortly. The feed cut to black. The concourse erupted, not in chaos, but in recognition. Cheers mingled with shouts. Phones rose higher, capturing every angle. Sophia's voice shook with adrenaline as she narrated into her feed. The CEO just walked away. He had no answer. Elijah stood still, breathing evenly. The storm inside him had not calmed, but it had sharpened. Tonight was no longer about survival. It was about truth, laid bare for all to see. The monitors above the concourse remained black after Richard Alcott's abrupt exit, their empty glow reflecting the stunned faces of passengers. For a moment, the silence in the terminal was absolute, heavy, as though the air itself was waiting. Then voices erupted questions, anger, astonishment. Phones rang out with alerts. Reporters pushed through the crowd. And strangers who had been hesitant minutes before now spoke openly, their voices cracking the shell of fear. Charles Whitman rose from his seat, clutching Elijah Monroe's briefcase tightly. His usually measured tone carried uncharacteristic heat as he turned to the executives huddled by the glass wall. You think this ends with a cut feed? You think you can just unplug accountability? His words were not shouted, but each one landed with the force of a verdict. The crowd murmured agreement, emboldened by his sharpness. Sophia Nguyen, her live stream numbers spiking into the hundreds of thousands, narrated breathlessly. Viewers, you saw it. The CEO couldn't withstand the truth. He walked away, and here, in this terminal, people are speaking out. This is no longer one man's fight. It's everyone's. Passengers who had kept their heads low began raising their voices. A woman in a green scarf stepped forward. I watched them take him. I didn't speak, and I regret it. But tonight, I want to say it. They targeted him because of his skin. Her voice cracked, but she didn't falter. A man near the gate, middle-aged with tired eyes, nodded slowly. I whispered to my wife that he didn't belong in first class. I said it because I believed it, and I was wrong. I see that now. I was part of the silence that let this happen. His words trembled, his hands gripping the strap of his carry-on like a lifeline. The crowd leaned in. Some eyes were wet, others wide, but all were listening. The honesty was contagious. The unmasking of prejudice, raw and unedited. Caleb Johnson tugged at his mother's sleeve again. Mommy, can I say something too? She hesitated, but the boy wriggled free, stepping into the open. His small voice cut through the noise. He didn't do anything wrong, but you all treated him like he was bad. That's not fair. The simplicity of his truth silenced the room, guilt and recognition hanging heavy. Elijah watched from the center of the concourse, his arms at his sides, his eyes steady. He hadn't asked for their confessions, but hearing them filled him with something deeper than satisfaction. It was the shift he had longed for. Not vindication, but revelation. The gray-suited woman executive finally broke her silence. Dr. Monroe, she said, her voice thin. This is spiraling beyond control. We can still negotiate. We can know. Elijah interrupted. His tone was not harsh, but absolute. This isn't yours to negotiate anymore. This belongs to them. He gestured to the passengers, the crowd, the witnesses whose voices had begun to rise. Your company had the chance to own the truth. You buried it until it clawed its way out. Now, you'll live with it in the open. Phones buzzed again. National outlets were reporting live. Hashtags surged online. Show truth in 1A. Systemic bias. Elijah Monroe. Headlines splashed across feeds. Neurosurgeon humiliated. Airline collapses under scrutiny. Sophia's live stream captured Elijah's face as he spoke once more. This is not just about me. This is about every quiet humiliation endured by those who could not fight back. Tonight, you all saw it. And tonight, none of us can pretend we didn't. The supervisor still crouched near his tablet, his earlier arrogance replaced by fear. He muttered, "They'll bury me for this." Elijah turned, hearing him. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Or maybe you'll finally learn what it means to stand up instead of comply." Across the terminal, a group of young employees in Summit Air uniforms huddled near the service desk. One, barely in his 20s, raised his hand hesitantly. "Dr. Monroe." He called. "I've seen the chat rooms, the way they talk about passengers. It's not just tonight. It's every day." His voice shook, but he pressed on. "I'll testify. I'll hand it all over." The executive spun toward him, faces sharp with betrayal, but the boy did not back down. The crowd's energy surged, a swell of recognition that the cracks were widening too fast to be sealed. Sophia lifted her camera higher, her voice trembling. "Did you hear that a whistleblower, live, admitting systemic bias in Summit Air operations? This is bigger than we imagined." Elijah's phone buzzed once more. Another secure message, Federal Compliance Review initiated. Media outlets requesting interview. Stand firm. He exhaled slowly. The world was moving faster than even he had anticipated. His humiliation on that plane had been a spark. But now, here, it was fire spreading into boardrooms, courtrooms, living rooms across the country. And yet, in the noise, in the fury, Elijah felt the weight of his own heart. This was not the victory he had dreamed of. It was messy, raw, painful. The boy's words still echoed in his mind. That's not fair. No matter how much power he held in that moment, he could not erase the sting of having been treated as less. Richard Alcott did not return to the screens that night. The black glow above the concourse stood as its own silent indictment. But Elijah did not need him anymore. The story was already bigger than one CEO. Elijah stepped back, letting the voices of others fill the air. Confessions, apologies, testimonies. It was no longer his burden alone. It was theirs too. And as he listened, he felt the beginnings of something fragile but real accountability being born, not from policy, but from truth. By the next morning, the story had spread like wildfire. Every major network ran the footage Sophia Nguyen had streamed the removal, the live stream mockery, the damning system logs, the CEO faltering and walking off camera. The hashtags, #truth in A1A and Elijah Monroe, were no longer just trending. They were everywhere, filling feeds, morning shows, and front pages. Federal officials moved quickly. The Department of Transportation announced an emergency inquiry into Summit Air's compliance with civil rights regulations. The Federal Aviation Administration added its own review, citing serious concerns of procedural abuse. News anchors repeated the phrase manual override like it was evidence in a trial. And in a way, it was. Richard Alcott, who had vanished from screens the night before, was nowhere to be found. Rumors swirled that he was meeting with the board, that he had offered to resign, that he was already on a jet headed for a private retreat. For Summit Air, there was no escape. Their shares plummeted overnight, wiping billions from their market value. Investors who once championed their stability now called for heads to roll. Inside the terminal, Elijah Monroe had not left immediately. He sat in a quiet corner near a coffee kiosk, his leather briefcase returned safely by Charles Whitman. Cameras swarmed nearby, reporters begging for comment. Elias said little, his silence more powerful than any soundbite. He knew the images, the dignity. The refusal to flinch spoke louder than words. Charles finally broke the silence between them. "You've done something I've never seen before," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "You've taken their script and burned it in front of them." Elijah looked at him, weary but steady. "I didn't burn it," he replied softly. "They burned it themselves. I just refused to look away." Sophia approached cautiously. Her phone finally lowered after hours of recording. Her eyes were red with exhaustion, but alight with conviction. "Dr. Monroe," she said, "people are asking what's next. They want to hear from you." Elijah studied her, then the crowd beyond strangers leaning over barricades, waiting for his words. He exhaled slowly. "What's next isn't about me," he said. "It's about whether we finally admit this isn't an isolated story. This happens every day to people without cameras, without live streams, without contracts to leverage. If all they learn is my name, then nothing changes. If they see themselves in this, maybe everything does." Sophia nodded, understanding the gravity of what he was entrusting her with. "I'll make sure they hear it that way," she promised. Meanwhile, Summit Air headquarters descended into chaos. Emails leaked, Slack messages surfaced. One thread from the so-called Gate Gossip channel confirmed what Elijah had said: mockery of passengers, coded slurs, even betting pools on who would crack under pressure. The whistleblower, the young employee from the terminal, provided screenshots to federal investigators. They spread across news outlets within hours. Public anger reached fever pitch. Civil rights organizations held press conferences demanding systemic reform in the airline industry. Politicians, sensing momentum, tweeted statements of solidarity. Some cynically tried to turn it into campaign fodder, but most recognized it was bigger than politics. This was about dignity. Elijah returned home that evening, finally stepping through the doors of his Atlanta clinic. The waiting room was quiet, patients gone for the day. His staff greeted him not with cheers, but with hugs, the kind that said, "We saw, we know, we're proud." He sat in his office, staring at the skyline outside his window. His phone buzzed endlessly. Calls from media, invitations to speak at universities, requests from advocacy groups. He let most go unanswered. What mattered most to him was not the stage, but the seed, the possibility that the world might finally see what he had been forced to live. His daughter, Maya, walked in quietly. She was only 14, but her eyes carried the same steadiness he had shown in the terminal. "Dad," she said softly, "you didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for us, for everyone." Elijah pulled her close, his voice catching. That was always the point. Back in Washington, hearings were scheduled. Summit Air executives were subpoenaed. Richard Alcott's resignation letter leaked to the press, thin, evasive, but final. The gray-suited woman, the silver glasses man, the folio executive all faced removal. And for the first time in its history, Summit Air suspended operations voluntarily, grounding flights until further notice. The financial loss was staggering, but the cultural loss was deeper. Passengers across the nation began sharing their own stories under the hashtag #TruthInNoir. A black teacher from Detroit, denied boarding because her ID didn't match the system. a Latina businesswoman, downgraded from first class after a computer glitch. An elderly man in a wheelchair, ignored when asking for assistance. Thousands of stories poured in, painting a damning picture that no PR campaign could erase. Elijah read them late into the night, each one a mirror reflecting the larger truth. He realized then that his role was not just survivor or whistleblower. He was being called into something larger, an architect of change. The next morning, Metasphere's board held an emergency call. "Elijah," the chairwoman said, "you've forced the world to listen. Now, we can either step back and let it pass, or we can lead. You've built systems that keep planes flying, hospitals running, supply chains moving. What if we apply that same precision to justice?" Elijah leaned back, eyes narrowing. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating. He had not asked to become a symbol, but perhaps he could become a builder of something beyond medicine. He spoke slowly, each word deliberate. "Then we lead, not with anger, not with spectacle, but with accountability, real accountability, the kind that rewrites the systems from the inside." The board agreed, and so began the first steps toward what the media would soon call the Monroe Doctrine, a framework for equity protocols in corporate infrastructure, binding technology to the values it claimed to serve. But for Elijah, it was never about doctrines or headlines. It was about Maya, about Caleb Johnson, about the passengers who had whispered apologies into microphones, about the boy who had tugged on his mother's sleeve and said what no executive could admit: "That's not fair." The fallout was systemic. Yes, federal reviews, resignations, cultural reckonings. But the real victory was quieter, the shift in ordinary hearts, the confessions, the courage to finally speak. Alicia knew reform was a long road, filled with resistance and backlash. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. 2 months later, the stage lights at a packed auditorium in New York glowed warm against polished wood. The event had been billed not as a conference, but as a gathering, a space where truth and reform could share the same roof. Rows of chairs were filled with policymakers, executives, teachers, nurses, and students, ordinary people who had followed every step of Elijah Monroe's story. At center stage, a single podium waited. Behind it, a screen displayed the words "Dignity in Action." The crowd hushed as Elijah walked forward, his steps measured, his suit simple, his leather briefcase resting quietly in his hand, the same briefcase that had been held by Charles Whitman the night of his removal. He placed it gently on the floor, then looked out over the faces before him. There was no teleprompter, no script, just the weight of his experience and the clarity of his voice. "When I boarded a plane in Atlanta," Elijah began, his tone calm but resonant, "I was just another traveler on his way to work. But to the system that judged me, I was never just a traveler. I was a disruption. I was a risk. I was a mistake to be flagged and erased." A ripple of recognition moved through the room. They dragged me down an aisle not because I shouted, not because I threatened, but because I existed in a space they did not believe I belonged. And when they did, the world saw not just my humiliation, but theirs. He paused, letting the silence settle. "But what matters is not what happened to me. What matters is what it revealed." On the screen behind him, images appeared. Sophia Nguyen's live stream footage. Caleb Johnson's small voice saying, "That's not fair." The system logs with Doyle M's initials. The evidence that had ignited a reckoning. This wasn't about one airline. Elijah continued. This was about the quiet, constant erosion of dignity that millions endure every day. in offices, in schools, in hospitals. It's the raised eyebrow at the boardroom door, the assumption that you're lost when you're the professor, the laugh in the chat room when your name appears. It's the 1,000 cuts no one sees until one day. They bleed out in public. The room held its breath. And yet, Elias said, his voice softening, I do not stand here tonight to condemn. I stand here to remind us that systems are built by people, and what people build, people can change. Applause swelled, but Elijah lifted a hand, asking for quiet. I will not pretend this journey has been easy. I felt anger. I felt shame. I felt the sting of being less in the eyes of others. But I also felt something else. I felt the strength of strangers who refused to stay silent. I felt the innocence of a child who spoke truth when adults would not. I felt the power of witnesses who became voices, and voices who became change. He looked down for a moment, gathering himself. His mind flickered to Maya, watching from the front row, her hands folded, her eyes steady. Forgiveness is not erasure, he said quietly. It does not mean we forget. It means we choose not to let the wound dictate the future. I forgive, not because they asked, but because I refuse to carry their burden any longer. I forgive because I want my daughter to inherit not my pain, but my hope. The audience stirred, tears visible on faces across the room. Hope, Elias said, straightening, is not passive. It is not waiting for things to improve. Hope is the work we do when we decide that fairness is not optional, that dignity is not negotiable. Hope is what happens when we build systems that see people as they are, not as they are feared to be. On the screen, the words, the Monroe Doctrine, appeared a framework already being piloted in multiple corporations, embedding accountability into every system from hiring to customer service. This doctrine is not mine alone, Elijah said. It belongs to everyone who has been told they don't belong. It belongs to the passengers who spoke up, to the employees who exposed truth, to the children who refused to inherit our silence. It belongs to you. Applause thundered, rising and swelling. But Elijah remained composed. He had learned that true change was not in the noise, but in the resolve that followed. He closed with words he had carried since that night at the terminal. When they dragged me down that aisle, I thought I was being diminished. But what I learned is this: no one can take your dignity unless you surrender it. And when you hold it, even in the face of humiliation, it becomes more powerful than any title, any contract, any empire. The room rose to its feet, applause crashing like waves, sustained, unstoppable. Cameras flashed. Live streams beamed his words to millions. But Elijah's eyes found only one face, Maya's, glistening with pride. He smiled softly, a man who had carried the weight of injustice and turned it into a blueprint for change. For her, for Caleb, for everyone who had whispered that's not fair and finally been heard. The story of Dr. Elijah Monroe is not only about one man's courage. It's about the quiet truths many of us have faced in our own lives. At some point, we've all been underestimated, ignored, or judged unfairly. The lesson here is simple, but profound. Dignity is not something others grant us. It is something we carry within, even when the world tries to strip it away. For older generations, this story reminds us of the battles fought before, the marches, the voices raised for equality. It is proof that even today, injustice can wear a polished uniform and a polite smile. But it also shows us that change is possible, not through revenge, but through accountability, resilience, and hope. Dr. Monroe teaches us that forgiveness is not weakness. It is the strength to refuse bitterness and to choose healing. His choice to transform humiliation into reform is a call for all of us to stand firm in who we are, to protect the dignity of others, and to leave behind a legacy of courage that future generations can carry forward. Thank you so much for being here with us and walking through this journey. Stories like these matter because you listen, reflect, and share. If this touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the stories that inspire change. Together, we can make sure dignity is never negotiable.